Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for week 2, episode 2 of Hidden Gems. Again, this is a passion project on the behalf of the Salam Religious Services Committee. We're really excited to bring this project to you today. Last week we had Imam Amr join us as the co-moderator. Alhamdulillah, this week we have one of our youth, Sister Celine, joining us to moderate session 2. And we have a special guest, another hidden gem in the Sacramento community, Sister Maheen Ahmed, who is the legislative director for Assembly Member Rob Bonta from Alameda County. So we're just actually going to get right into it. We want to know a little more about Maheen. Maheen, you're no stranger to the Sacramento community. I've known you all my life. We've went to school together. We've shared a lot of experiences. And you've grown with this community over the years. Could you tell us a little bit more about your personal background?
Sure. Well, assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you both for having me on today. Just really appreciate it. And your kind words, definitely. Yeah, most of our lives have known each other. Alhamdulillah. So my background, I guess starting from when I grew up here, I actually was born and raised in Los Angeles, grew up here in Sacramento, came here when I was 10, and since then went to Al-Arqam, the Islamic school that many folks have graduated from and doing great things in our community, alhamdulillah. And I think that was a point onward that Sacramento became home, and that's where I started to build community. But I don't think I really essentially understood what it meant to be in community until later on, when you're in high school, when you're in college, when you're trying to kind of figure out your path and get more involved, volunteer, go to like Muslim Youth Leadership Program. It's a plug for CARES program. When I actually started to feel like, okay, well, this is somewhere that I can actually call home because I'm getting involved, where I'm giving to the community and I'm also receiving that love and support that I need. I think in terms of a place to start, that's kind of where it started. I went to that school until 8th grade, then went to St. Francis for high school, which was an interesting way to get more into a different part of our community, going into a Catholic school. And then from there, UC Davis, stayed home here in Sacramento when I was able to go, which was really beautiful because I was able to still continue to build and give back to Sacramento and not have to go away for college. Like a lot of folks, they move and then they come back. Did that, was working at CARE the entire time I was going to college. So that was really my family, my community. And I think truly through CARE and working to serve the Muslim community, going to all the masajid, learning who all the leaders were, and being there trying to provide these direct services to our youth, to our community members, is when I actually felt like this was home. Because I think that's for a lot of folks, they don't really get to really say that or feel that, but alhamdulillah, through that service, I really felt that I was able to make that connection.
Jazakallah khair. There's this thing about Sacramento that a lot of people say, like when they move here, and they say that there's no community like the Sacramento Muslim community, or they say Sacramento is a very community-oriented city. Like, what was your reality, or like your experienced reality growing up in the Sacramento Muslim community, and how has it shaped like your outlook and your goals, and like your sense of purpose?
I think for me, Sacramento Muslim community has a lot of, I will say it's very different for every person. I can't speak for someone from like the Black Muslim community, right? And what their struggle and what their lived reality is, or someone who's Arab, right? I think my reality as like a Muslim Pakistani is very unique in that, I will say, like, we do have our challenges. I think we do have a lot of growth that we need to do as a community when it comes to even like being inclusive of all ethnicities, but then also of like all of the different, I think, like the paths within Islam too, right? I do think that is something that I felt very early on, like, okay, I understand this message is like, like this sort of ideology and like this community and this one's that one. And politically I don't align with this one, but like, like all of that. So I think I definitely had that. And I think to an extent still do. But I think that's also the beauty of the Muslim community here in Sacramento, where it's small enough that you can get a feel and understand for the various like different sectors of the Muslim community that is here, and feel like you have the ability to actually be part of it in order to also give back and make some change. Because if you talk about LA, if you talk about the Bay Area, like it's just so big and vast that it's like, where do I even begin? But here, and I think because my work at CARE spanned across all of them, regardless of like, the ethnic backgrounds that are welcome there, or like everything like that. I mean, there were some challenges, I think, but for the most part, because I worked with an organization that was kind of very beloved and provided services to everyone, I was able to have that in everywhere. So it made my experience a lot more positive than I think it is for a lot of people. But I do think for the most part, Sacramento is like that city with a small town feel, and the Muslim community really does embody that as well, for good and for bad, I think.
Yeah, most definitely. And you talked a little bit about CARE. I
Yeah.
think just naturally, I mean, we have three MYLP alum on this call right now. So I think you all can really attest to like how amazing of an experience you get through that, that one singular CARE program,
Yeah.
and how it reignites that want, or even ignites for some people that want to serve the community in any way.
Mm.
So, as someone who you mentioned through college was working at CARE, I don't know how you manage that, because I work full time at CARE right now, and it's like, it's crazy.
I question that
And
too. Looking.
yeah, so it's like, for me, my question is like, what was your professional trajectory like? Speaking as someone, like you said, like someone who I would say got a head start in terms of, your career in college, and, alhamdulillah, with that blessing of being able to serve the community. How did, what direction did your trajectory go in after that?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I will say it started from the root of wanting to serve. Community service is where it started. I didn't know what civic engagement was, or like being active. I think our youth now, and Celine, you can attest to this too. Like, like our communities now, our younger generations, like they definitely know more. They're a lot more socially conscious than I think I was in high school. But for me, it was community service. My parents very much instilled that in me from a young age. But at the high school that I went to in Catholicism, and what they ingrained at St. Francis was very much like service is a huge part of our faith. And alhamdulillah, that's the case with Islam as well. But it was very much so driven into like, I think, the culture at that school. And I remember specifically as well, there was a prayer that we used to say very often, the prayer of St. Francis, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. And I remember I was like, yes, that is what I want to be. I want to be that vessel. I want to be that instrument. So then going to the Muslim Youth Leadership Program, I think helped me see, oh, this is a way that I can serve the Muslim community. I can gain leadership skills. I can go into that sphere. This is what the capital looks like. I'd never been before that, even though I lived here in Sacramento. And from there onward, I think it was just a nuance of like, okay, I know I want to live a life of service. How do I do that? I think for my parents, it was, oh, become a doctor. You'll be able to do both. And for me, I was like, yeah, okay, sure. Then I tried that route. Definitely did volunteer, Shifa Clinic's amazing clinic here that I got a chance, an opportunity to work with, and other places as well. And I was like, this isn't for me. And I started with CARE as an intern the summer before my freshman year of college. And from there on, I just loved it. And I was like, okay, I'll become a doctor, and then I will just volunteer my free time, like with organizations like CARE, and like donate and stuff. But I realized that that wasn't going to cut it for me. I think I wanted to do more. So then from there, I switched majors to community development, very much in line with service and giving back. And beyond that, there were some other experiences that I had at CARE that really shifted my lens to be like, okay, but if I want to make systemic change, because now I'm learning about how there are so many social inequities that are ingrained within our policy structures, right? how do I now make a change in that? And how do I make sure that the Muslim community is being recognized and included in that process? And the answer to that is you start to do it on your own too, right? You start to build that power. And that's how it started for me. That's how I kind of was able to figure out that policy is what I wanted to do, and go from there. So starts with service, starts with like the core foundational principles of giving back and wanting for your brother what you want for yourself, right? The golden rule that we have in all our faiths. And then,
All right,
yep,
thank
that was
you,
the one.
Maheen. For those of you who didn't know, as Osama said, I was also part of MYLP, and Maheen was actually my advisor. So it's
Yeah,
good to see Maheen again. So now talking about your career, because as someone who's now a freshman at UC Davis and is interested in the path of policy, I want to hear a little bit more about your role at the state capitol and how it's like evolved, because you started as a fellow, you
yeah.
an aide, and then to a director. So if you can elaborate a little bit more, because as you said, a whole bunch of us young people are really into policy now, instead of becoming doctors and lawyers, we want to work at the Capitol. We want to hear more about those positions. So if you could elaborate, I'd be more than honored to hear about it.
Yeah, no, Celine, it's so nice to see you here too. And for you to even say that you're excited about the world of policy, I mean, that's something that I yearn to hear from our youth, alhamdulillah. So yeah, I mean, I think going back to what I was saying about being involved at CARE, like I literally first stepped foot into the Capitol when I was in high school for Muslim Youth Leadership Program, but I don't think I still connected the dots really then. It wasn't until I served as the Muslim Day at the Capitol coordinator for CARE my third year of college was when I was in charge of this event. That was a lobbying event for Muslims across the state. I had to bring them to the Capitol, make sure that first they came and they were interested in this. So like you pitch it to them in a way that interests them, which is very difficult to do in the Muslim community. And then from there, set a legislative agenda. What are the bills that are actually going to support our communities or, hurt our communities, and have our folks come and lobby on those. Make sure that they're trained, they know how to talk to legislators, make sure that the meetings are set up with the legislators and their staff. Did all of that, alhamdulillah, the day was successful. But then I left feeling like, okay, this was great. Like everyone seemed empowered, like that's what we wanted from the community. But I'm still working here at CARE, trying to kind of wrap up this event, days later, weeks later. And I'm wondering, did our lobbying day make a difference in the vote that the legislator cast? And I think for me, the answer was, firstly, like, I don't know to what extent it did, but I do think that it didn't have the impact that I would want our community to have, the power that I would want our community to have, the influence that we should have. Who is at the legislator's ear, like at the 11th hour? Who are those lobbyists? Who are those communities? Who did they listen to? And so no one really had those answers for me from the Muslim community, at least here in Sacramento, to the extent that I wanted, like understanding the process, the nuances, like at which corner in the process of when a bill becomes a law is it the most effective to talk to a legislator, right? Things like that. And so I heard about the fellowship. It's a 1-year program that you can do after you graduate from college. You get units for graduate school, and you work as a full-time legislative aide. You get paid, as one too, and it's a really well-known program, alhamdulillah. So I was like, okay, let's give it a shot so I can learn the process. Alhamdulillah, was able to get in, then was hired on in the Capitol as legislative aide. That was in 2016. I started the fellowship literally like a couple weeks before the 2016 election. Definitely questioned my decision because I left CARE right before I started the fellowship, and now CARE's in the line of fire with Trump as president. So I didn't know if it was the best idea, and it was very difficult. I think it was a culture shock as well because they really weren't any Muslims that wore hijab in the Capitol, and the Muslims that we had just were a handful. So I think that's another story for how just difficult I think that journey was. But alhamdulillah, continued, trudging forward, made it to Ledge Aid. And alhamdulillah, I think from that point onward, was asked to become legislative director for the current office that I'm in, for the amazing member and the amazing team that I work for.
Thank you. I mean, you really like opened that door, because now I'm looking at people, because you often look for people who look like you when you step into a
Mhm.
workplace. And like you said, there wasn't that many, muhajjabas. There might have been Muslims, but they didn't necessarily wear the hijab, or they didn't outwardly express it. So now, like looking at you, I see someone who looks at me working in a place that I hope to work for in the future. But in order to like reach, you must have had like some sort of mentors. So, who were your mentors, and what did they teach you about identifying your role and empowering empowering your community? Like in this case, you talked a little about care and like the Muslim community in general, and
Yeah.
just the Sacramento community.
Yeah. I will say, like, it's very, very like flattering and just very kind of you to say all of that. Like, I'm here like getting emotional, but I'm like, I need to continue answering your question. So thank you very much for that. I think for me, alhamdulillah, I think I owe it really all, firstly, for the opportunity, like just this journey, the privilege. I think, alhamdulillah, just very, very grateful for that, to my parents, for really instilling these values of kind of trudging forward, and really through the challenges and everything. But after that, I think my mentor, my biggest one, I think who you both also know, is Basim. And I can't answer this question without mentioning him, mashallah, executive director of Care Sacramento right now. Truly the only person that I really knew that was in this work, as a Muslim, that I could like look up to. That was, I was very close with. I started, under him as an intern, and then worked for him. But throughout that process, he really showed what it meant to be someone who's principled, in faith, and not going to flinch when it comes to being, unapologetically Muslim, as we say. But then also being very well respected in this community, and someone who I think a lot of folks looked up to in both the Muslim and non-Muslim communities. And so he really paved the path for me. I think I don't think I'm the one who like paved it. I definitely have, giants that, I'm standing on the shoulders of, and he is one of them. I think beyond him, and he's still someone that I go to every day now. Beyond him, there are others that were in the policy world from different communities of color. Especially I remember my first year in the Capitol when I was a fellow. Two women in particular that volunteer for Muslim Youth Leadership Program every year, Black women, who I had coffees with, and they understood the difficulty of being someone who, was of color, who this system wasn't really built for, and how do you work. And I remember like just crying and being like, yeah, this is really hard. Like, I don't know what I'm doing here. I have this imposter syndrome. I don't see people like me. Like, I needed to even ask them to have a space to pray, because in the Capitol they didn't have a prayer room. Like, how do you go about being unapologetically you, in a space that, no one else has really been in before. So I really do owe it to other people along the way who have really looked out for me, you know, uh, throughout my time at the Capitol as well. But definitely starting with Basim, and then just other people in my life, alhamdulillah. Just very grateful. And I think for the encouragement of family and friends, friends who truly knew me from the get-go. But then I think the community also was super supportive when I got into these roles, and when it kind of came out there that I was, you know, working in the Capitol and doing this, doing that, blah, 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 like, folks started to be like, we're really proud of you. And those kind words, like, I think they went a long way, like, just to be like, okay, like, I have people who have my back, when I'm doing this work, alhamdulillah.
Yeah, mashallah. I mean, your story is just honestly so amazing to hear. So you did talk a little bit about some of your, connections with people as you work through the Capitol.
Mhm.
And so now leading up to that, I'm sure now you have a big network now that you're a director there too. So what does your network currently look like, and what sort of people are in it, and how do they impact, your outlook and perspective? Because you did talk about how your time at St. Francis did change your perspective, after going from Arkham, right, to St. Francis. So I do want to hear a little bit more about, now you're in your workplace, how do these people change, your outlook and your perspective? And how did your relationship, whether it was good or bad from the start, develop over time?
Yeah, I think network is a very like important question. It's one that people, I think, have a lot of assumptions about the fact that your network has to be really big to be able to like move forward in this world and do what you want to do. But I will say that while there's truth to that, it matters a lot more who those people are, the quality of your network. And if those people are ones that you align with in values. Because when we talk about Islamically to our suhbah, right, like that's very important who you keep around you. And so that goes with work as well. It doesn't really matter sometimes about like sharing the same exact faith, but it's about those core values and principles that a lot of people share. So for me, I was told in the beginning when I was at the Capitol, like, oh, you need to go to like every single networking event out there. So then that meant like in the first few weeks, they would be like, oh, like 3 every day essentially. And so for me, as someone who's also an introvert, I was like, okay, this is a lot. Also the fact that as being someone who's a practicing Muslim, like, you know, I had my prayer times, and then on top of that, like they're at bars and things like that. So I was like, I just didn't feel comfortable. I did go when it was necessary, but it was one of those things where I kind of limited my time. And what I told myself was like, okay, I will go to, you know, like a couple of these, stay for a short period of time, but my goal is to talk to at least 2 people and make sure that I have a good sort of like more robust conversation rather than just exchanging business cards, because I want to be able to then hit that person up later for coffee, where I know that my strength is to talk to people and build relationships one-on-one so that I can have a deeper relationship with them. Because if I want someone in my network, I want to make sure that we're on the same page and that there's alignment and, you know, the people that we are striving to be in this world. So with that being said, my network, the core network that I surround myself with, is actually pretty small. But I know that these are people who, you know, really have my back, that are really amazing, beautiful hearts that will support me. But then we'll also keep it real. Because your network is not just going to be people that are cheerleaders. You need to have people that will tell you like, oh, Mahin, like, I don't think that's a good idea. Or like, maybe you should do this. Or people that I can feel comfortable going to for advice. That will keep me on course, because in this world of politics, especially as a Muslim who's practicing, I think it's very easy to get sidetracked. I think it's easy to lose sight of what your goals and values and your principles are. And so you need those people in your corner that will respect you, that will love you, that will care for you. But then because of that, they will also keep you in check.
Jazakallah khair. I have a, I guess, off the cuff question, because we're talking about networks, and I know, you know, personally, you and I, and we interact a lot when it comes to the professional field, right? I'm kind of more interested in what I guess I'd call your spiritual network. You know, within the Muslim community, what does your network look like? Because, you know, from my experience, your professional life, you know, the trajectory of your professional life really is influenced and impacted by your spiritual trajectory. And last week, something very interesting, actually, last week we had Dr. Mutuli Amir come on with us, and I see him in the crowd today, but he spoke about his network back when he was in college. And he was literally telling us like, yeah, we came together, we started this thing and it was called the MSA. And I'm like, hold on a minute, like you guys started the MSA. And subhanAllah, this week I'm thinking about like, you know, we've both served with MSA West, and now mashallah, you're serving with MSA National, you know, in one capacity or another. So, you know, through that, you do build a sort of spiritual network and mentors that do see eye to eye and understand you, you know, spiritually. So could you speak a little bit to that and like the value that's had on your outlook, your purpose, and kind of how that influenced your trajectory?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think when it comes to spiritual network, alhamdulillah, I think part of what kept me on course and feeling like I could continue moving forward in, you know, any sort of work that I was doing professionally was really like, I think the relationships that I built throughout my experience with MSAs, starting with like MSA at UC Davis and then going into MSA West and MSA National. Like you can think about it as extracurriculars and be like, oh yeah, like this is like stuff that I wanted to do, like to help, you know, organize the Muslims. Or you can think about it as the relationships that you're gaining and the spaces that you're in on a weekly, almost daily basis that are really feeding your soul. And when you said that, Osama, like it really reminded me of just like that's such a blessing that is very much overlooked, sometimes even by me, about the impact that that's had on my life. Like, would I be where I am now, alhamdulillah, with my convictions and my faith, if it wasn't for the spaces that I was in on a weekly basis? Like, just as an example, with MSA West, I was in a halaqah with our board members with Sheikh al-Muslim on a weekly basis, just for our board. Like I think the privilege, I think, of that space alone, and having access to like a sheikha, like that, like I think back and I'm like, wow, that not a lot of people can say that, and in college. But beyond that too, even now, like, there is a lot that we have to do to make sure that we're spiritually having an upkeep, because we talk about burnout a lot when it comes to politics and community organizing and like, all the spaces that we're in. But burnout really happens when we are not feeding our souls, right? Like, you have to make sure that you're pulling from a well, and that well should be bottomless. And the only bottomless well that there is that connection with Allah, right? So how do we do that? I think I make sure that I am keeping in touch with like my spiritual community, different shuyukh that I go to for advice, religious people that I know in my circles that provide me with like the discipline that I need on a daily basis to be able to maintain my practice. And alhamdulillah, I think that, in addition to always seeking knowledge, always learning about our faith, making sure that you're never really feeling like, okay, like I'm good, because I don't think we're ever able to be stable. It's either going up or going down. And so how do you make sure that you're always growing? And yeah, I think when I talk about my small network too, that's very much inclusive of those people that remind me of Allah, and make sure that I'm staying on the straight path spiritually. Alhamdulillah.
Yeah, and that kind of reminds me of reflection that sometimes when I think about like work or any job that's tied to like a contract and a paycheck,
Yeah.
where like there are things at stake when it comes to your performance. And for a lot of us, like, and I'm sure you can echo it, for some of us, like our first experience working in a professional setting where you have responsibility, you have to execute, you experience burnout, is in college with these Muslim organizations, right, where it's like you're volunteering your time, right? The stakes aren't very high, and that your paycheck depends on it. But at the end of the day, like you said, there's like that bottomless well where the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is like your only goal, because there aren't really many things getting in the way of that, like a paycheck or clout or a bonus on your resume or whatnot. So that's it's a really interesting, that's what it caused me to think about. But subhanAllah, yeah. And I guess along those lines, and building community and working to expand and strengthen the quality of your community, comes the importance of power building, right, and community power building. So I guess I first wanted to ask, for the sake of the audience, what is power building? What and why is it important?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think I can go on about that for a while, but I guess to keep it kind of brief, when we talk about power in our society right now, especially, let me just say, as like the Muslim community, I think there's a lot of negative connotations with that. It's like, okay, yeah, like, like power is just like this thing that's over here. And we don't really look at it as neutral, which it actually is. Power is neutral, and it could be used for good or for bad. And when we talk about power itself too, we also have to realize that it's like not unilateral. Like, there is a relationship there. Power is built through relationships. So if you don't have somebody on the receiving end of power who will gain influence from what you do, then you can't really exert power, right? So it's all relational at the end of the day. And so that's how you have to like kind of look at it. It requires a relationship. And you have to realize that someone may have the capacity to have power over someone else, but that other person also has some sort of power as well. And so it's a give and a take as well. So by saying that, I think it's helpful for us to know that when we talk about power as like ordinary people that we are, we gain it through our relationships, and that is through each other, building that relationship and then organizing it. Um, and I think the other thing with power that I want to touch on before diving into this a little bit more is when we build power, we talk about how we have to talk about how, first of all, we have it and internalizing that fact. Because what I see a lot of times is the Muslim community works from a space of feeling like less than, like feeling like we have this inferiority complex, and that, like, oh, like, everybody is so powerful. That may be true because of like structural systemic like oppression, and I will not deny that, like, that is what we're fighting and what we're up against. But there's this realization that inherently isn't there about how we actually can take power as well, and we have to seize it, right? Because power, you have to demand it. You're not just going to be given up power just like that. And then power also doesn't mean just like having a seat at the table. Like, yes, get that seat at the table, but that's not just power. Power is actually using that seat to do something about it, and to actually, you know, make a difference, have a say, and build that relationship to be able to get what you want. That doesn't necessarily mean that we should be building relationships with like everybody, right? Like, we shouldn't be building with some folks, law enforcement, for example, and people that really don't see us as human. Because in that way, then if we build those relationships and we allow them to say, oh yeah, like, they're at the table with us, or like, yeah, we have a relationship with them, they can actually abuse that power too. So that is kind of the core of what power is to me. And when we build it, it means seizing on understanding that we have power too, empowering ourselves in that sense of like, okay, there's that acknowledgement that we have this, and then building those relationships that are necessary within the Muslim community, and then outside it with the right partners in coalition to then organize. And that is where true power is actually made and felt, is when we organize our people in the right direction, um, and gain power.
I guess a follow-up question I have, because again, when you're involved in a lot of spaces, right, different communities and people with different realities define power building
Mhm.
in different ways. And as Muslims, again, you mentioned it a little bit, power is seen as ultimately something that can either exploit your nafs, right? And for someone with a weak nafs, or a weak set of desires, will succumb to that, right, and harm people with it. Or someone with it can be a source of good for someone or a community with a disciplined nafs. So I guess my question is, how can power building fall in line with our spiritual duty as Muslims to serve the most vulnerable in our community, and not one day become abusers of that power?
Yeah, I would say that if we have this understanding of power as being something that's relational and something that's built through these relationships, we inherently, as Muslims, understand that when we are in relationship with someone else, we follow, the hadith that I just mentioned before, the golden rule, like for your brother, your sister, what you want for yourself, right? Um, and you come from that place of love, that I am seeking Allah's pleasure, I'm seeking His love, to be able to, be someone who He is pleased with. And in order to do that, I have to then extend that love to my siblings, my community. And that's inherently that transfer of love over, right? That's how we look at things, especially when we're talking about power as well. Take that and take the word justice. Justice, there's a quote, and I always quote this, by Cornel West. Justice is what love looks like in public. And if you look at that as a concept then too, and we talk about love, then justice is just basically an extension of that, right? Because the starting point of justice in Islam, in our spiritual journey, is to love God and to be loved by God as well. And our faith really calls us to work towards justice. That is kind of the core essence of it. So when we talk about justice from that perspective, and that is what we're seeking to put out into this world, that is how we will use that power as well, so that we do good with it and use it to be able to build equitable communities for everyone that are just. Because at the core of it, that is what our faith calls us to do. And at the core of that is always love. So that is how I look at it. And that is what usually, that's what fuels me.
I really like that quote. Justice is what love looks like in public. I'm gonna keep that in mind. So, going back to kind of like talking about how in your own experience you found out that, being a doctor wasn't necessarily for you, but what advice do you have for those who don't necessarily want to work in politics, but want to empower themselves within their community?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because not everybody, ends up working at the Capitol. I will say that it starts with understanding that we each have agency in what our community looks like, no matter if you are in the, system, the institutional power that's in our communities, or if you're, working in a field such as like medicine. I think we do, a lot of times we just divorce ourselves from that reality, like, oh, like we can't make a difference, like, oh, we're not working in that field, for, like that's not something that we have to deal with or care about even. But that's so not true, because I think we have to make sure that whatever field we are in, that we are working to have equity in that. And there is an equity, I can guarantee you, in every sort of system out there, whether it's with like the pay difference between men and women, or how different communities are treated within certain sectors of society, certain jobs, certain disciplines. Like there is inequity everywhere. And realizing that we have a say in that, whether it means being able to point out a pay difference in, the private sector and taking it up to management, or wage differences in an organization where you can actually start to unionize, right? Like things like that, I think, are some small examples of what we can do. But beyond that too, each sector actually has policies that we write. Like in my job, like, I've worked on policies that are impacting doctors right now too. And people don't know it, that there are these things going on. There are organizations also that are out there that are literally lobbying for every single issue area out there. There's like the California Medical Association, there's the California Nurses Association, there's like, labor unions. And so they're all working to ensure that there's equity in those fields, and they all have lobbying days, they all have ways to get involved. So I think those are different ways that people can start to do that. But beyond that, I think beyond like the policy level, or like changes systemically within like the different jobs that we're in, it really does start with us. Are we doing what we can to educate ourselves about what's happening in society? What are our own privileges that we have? And I guarantee you, like, we all have various privileges that we inherently, by having that, have the responsibility to do something with it to help those that don't have that privilege. And if we educate ourselves about what's happening in society, and then teach, our children, or our spouses, or our parents, and get them to understand it, that is how community starts, right? It starts with yourself, then it extends out to your family, then it extends out to community at large. So even if you can't do any of what I've said about like the greater picture with the jobs and lobbying or anything, at the very least, you can start by educating yourself and those around you. Um, and that alone, inshallah, I think will help make a difference in just how socially conscious we are, to do what we can in our daily lives to be able to build community.
I really like how you like mentioned that, educating oneself is really important. And I think that's what, the next upcoming generation is really doing. Like they're really trying to be aware of kind of what's going on without them. And we're really
Yeah.
starting to recognize like our privileges, especially when we see that others don't necessarily have the same privileges. So, as we notice that there are others who don't have the same privileges as we do, what advice do you have for people like about some organizations and programs and resources that we can look into if we want to enact positive change and build power in our communities and give the privilege that we have back to others, because it's really important, that everyone's standing, at that equal starting line, basically.
Yeah. I mean, I will just underscore the importance of educating yourself and your family first. I think it starts with us being able to, in a way, like decolonize our minds, right? And then from there, like, how do we go on to help build our families so that we understand how society is functioning, how we're being impacted, how we impact others, all of that. But beyond that, before I even get to organizations, I feel like spaces such as masajid, I mean, that is a huge place that we don't have to really look much further than. And when we talk about a masjid, it's a communal space. Um, and even in the masjid, beyond like organizations like CARE that we've talked about at length, I mentioned Sacramento. Um, uh, I don't know if I mentioned Sacramento ACT, area congregations together. That's another organization that I'm involved in that, we definitely can use more Muslims in that space. But beyond, just talking about masjid alone, how do we make sure that our masajid are inclusive, right? How can we make sure that we are lessening the inequities that are there? Women in leadership positions, right? Who we invite into our spaces, community members that need essential services, like, who come in and ask for charity from the masjid. Are we being accessible language-wise to everybody? Or those that have disabilities, are we being accessible to them? A lot of our folks in our masajid need immigration services. They need housing services. Like, what are we doing to make sure that the place that we call the house of Allah, the place that we are very connected to, how do we make sure that we're doing what we can in these spaces to really support the masjid goers? Because that is where community starts, right? That is the beginning point. We don't have to look elsewhere. Like, we just need to start where we're at. Because there are power structures at play here, even within our own masajid, that if we actually allocated our resources well and we realigned our values to match and cater to and serve the most underserved person that goes to the masjid, I guarantee you that will be transformative for the entire community that goes to that space. And then it'll have ripple effects for how then we see our communities growing, whether it's the next generation or how we ourselves as those masjid goers will then interact with the rest of society, knowing that the power that we've built within our spaces is really striving towards justice. So I will definitely say masjid is like the biggest place that we should start with after our own families and ourselves as well. And then from there, go outward to CARE, to Sacramento ACT, to all these other spaces. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think a masjid, because when especially Muslims, when we're in our times of needs, we definitely always go to the masjid. And I think that's something Muslims always look for first wherever they move. When my family first moved to the Sacramento area, the first thing we looked for was a masjid, and then alhamdulillah, we found Salam. Shout out to Salam for kickstarting my career. But I don't know if Usama had anything else, but we do have some questions as well in the chat, but I'll hand it off right now to Usama if you have anything else to say.
Yeah, I think just, I guess, to close out before the Q&A, I find myself having that conversation a lot with people, and it always goes back to the masjid, right? And no matter what, like Sidin mentioned, when you go somewhere, like the beauty of Islam and this concept of ummah is that no matter where you are, you feel a sense of belonging as a Muslim, right? I often find myself like whether it's in a different continent or a different city, or even if I'm traveling alone, I'll go to a masjid and that is the first welcoming space, right? And, you know, although again, there are outlier situations where someone may not feel welcomed at a masjid for whatever reason, you know, um, which is, you know, oftentimes at the hand of an individual. But generally, like, again, we call it, you know, the house of Allah, because everybody is welcome in the eyes of Allah, right? And in his house. So again, you can go around, you can find whatever organization, you can find whatever, you know, entity or program or whatnot, but at the end of the day, your fulfillment won't come full circle the way it does at the masjid. um, you know, as some, like, I myself, you know, I, growing up, my friends used to make fun of me, in a kind way. It was an endearing joke that, like, I was a monk, right? I lived at the masjid. I went to school at the masjid. Like, everything I did happened at the masjid. And it's because, you know, and you mentioned this earlier, like, my parents instilled that sense of love, that that love you have for the masjid, there's no fulfillment you can derive from anywhere else, right? And, you know, it goes back to, again, it's all coming full circle, that concept of suhbah, right? And you're, whatever you befriend someone, whatever that common denominator is the extent of your fulfillment. And if that common denominator is Allah and Allah's pleasure, then it's a bottomless well, right? And your friendship will be deeper than you know it. So again, like, you know, it's really, it's not ironic, but it's I think it's very, very beautiful that no matter where you go, like, and with yourself, you know, you're in the political sphere, you're in community organizing spaces, yet you acknowledge that the masjid is where it all starts. And I think that's, you know, in a generation where we're seeing less people attending the masjid than ever, I think there's a need to revitalize, you know, and reignite that tradition and that importance that the masjid holds. So again, I think that was, you know, that was spot on. Um,
Alhamdulillah.
yeah.
I appreciate you saying that. I think I would add, like, the revitalization piece of it will come once individuals find themselves being welcomed and accepted into the spaces too, right? Because a reason for why we're seeing the decline is because people don't find themselves being seen, like, by the masjid. They're being marginalized, right? And they're not feeling welcome. I think it goes both ways. I think people are also forgetting, you know, the importance of the masjid. I think there's that. I won't deny, but from what I've seen, especially with people our age, like, a huge part is, well, I just don't feel like, you know, they are um, prioritizing building community and relationship in the way that we want it, or, you know, they're doing things that are not in alignment with my values, or, you know, they're making it just very much more difficult for me to exist in those spaces. And so yeah, I think it goes both ways, but at the core of it, we do understand that that space is important, right?
Right. So I'll hand it back off to Celine for the Q&A. I think she had a couple of questions that came in the pipeline.
Yeah, definitely. I did see some questions in the chat, so I'll start off with the one that Dr. Mitwali had, and he said, Sister Maheen, could you share with us the hardest and easiest task in your current job? So I mean, we're all very excited to hear a little bit about your job, so.
Yeah, so okay. I will say the easiest part of my job actually has been to get the main core components of, like, understanding the nuances of how, like, a bill becomes law, like, actually done, and moving things through the process. It's funny for me to say because people are like, I don't know how to do that. But, like, I think once you start to work in this field, you start to realize, like, moving things through the legislative process is not the biggest battle. It's more so, you know, who are you, who's in opposition, who's in support, appeasing them, coming to compromises, continuing moving forward unapologetically, making sure that you're having the right conversations that are needed. All of that stuff, I think, is where the meat of it is. But I think the process itself of how you introduce the bill, how do you logistically carry it through the committees, all that kind of stuff. I think I will say that is the easiest, but it's actually ironic that this past year it was probably one of the hardest because of COVID. Because of COVID and the pandemic, we weren't able to be there physically in the Capitol since I haven't been in the Capitol since March. And so we had to completely figure out how we were going to function as government. So it ended up being a little bit harder than expected. So that's, I think, part of the easiest thing I would say on a normal year, inshallah, that we will return to very soon. Hardest, I think, is really maintaining a sense of conviction and identity, and I think staying true unapologetically to who you are as a person, and your values as you're in this space. I think the culture is one that has been the hardest for me. It's not even about the job itself or even the other things that I was talking about, a bill. It's been more so, how do you make sure that you are holding true to who I am? So for example, if there are values that I have, if there's bills that are going through that, I have a difficult time with, how do I make sure that I convey that in a way that's respectful, knowing that I'm not the elected official on staff, but I still want to give my recommendation and my opinion. I think we've seen a lot of battles in the past couple of years where Muslims and I think communities that we care about, such as Palestinian communities, also like have had a very hard time existing in these spaces and having people who are vocally, supportive. How do you make sure to continue vocalizing, where you stand on that in a climate that is so chilling, has such a chilling effect, I think, on our freedom of speech in that way. And then also, making sure that you're able to practice your faith, asking for example, a prayer room, like making sure that I was asserting my needs as a Muslim, like while it may seem like inconvenient for someone else, like I don't want my faith to be seen, I don't want to see my own faith as an inconvenience to someone else. This is who I am, and I'm asking for accommodations that are, a right to ask for, whether it comes to prayer timings as well, or where I feel comfortable going for networking and where I don't. And all the different sort of things that I don't want to think of as restrictions, but more so these are things that I just carry as that are important to me. So I think that culture of being in the Capitol, and I always advise this to youth that want to, work here. It's like, okay, you want to work here, that's great. You'll be able to learn the politics, you'll be able to learn the policy, but let's talk about faith and how we can have spiritually grounded Muslims here, because I don't want anybody coming in here and at the end of the day, unfortunately, being a sellout, to be like, yeah, I'm Muslim, but like I really don't care about any of our belief systems. And that's because there's so few of us, that is what then will be seen, right? And so I think it's incumbent upon us being in this sort of space to be able to, I think it's our responsibility to be more vocal and to be more, I think, steadfast, because we're the ones that they look at. And we're representatives. So yeah, I think what I would say is the hardest one.
All right. Yeah, thank you. I mean, you kind of also answered a few other questions that were in the pipeline as well, like some advice you have for people entering that field. And like you said, it's probably really uncomfortable, like you said, and you don't want to be a sellout to your own religion, because as you mentioned, as the few people there, you're probably the only representatives of Islam within the capital. So that's what people see. That's what they're going to take Muslims for. So going on from that, like you said, there's probably was some ups and downs and at your time at the Capitol. So what did you do to kind of like manage your time? And, did you ever, I mean, I'm sure patience was something that you need a lot while you're there too, but what are some things you do to manage your time? Or if you just sometimes need a break, what do you do? I think that's really important to touch base on too.
Yeah. I actually did the complete opposite of like giving myself a break when I'm working here. Alhamdulillah, over the past 2 years, been in the Capitol for 4 years. Over the past 2 years, I actually was able to, alhamdulillah, obtain my master's in public administration while working at the Capitol too. So I was like, that was kind of what I did in my free time, essentially. But it was more so like, what can I do to gain more skill sets, continue to learn, because I know I have so much to learn, so much to grow in. And I believe that that was a stepping stone for that too. I think it was a form of self-care in a way, weirdly enough, to go to school and like do that for myself while serving others and serving the community. But I think another piece of that is um, my free time encompassed a lot of giving back, because to me, that is how I felt really fulfilled. Like if I'm doing this work, if I'm one of the few people that's in it, how do I make sure that I am connecting with youth, you know, if it's in MSA or if it's like Muslim Youth Leadership Program? I really felt that that was fulfilling to me and still is to this day. Um, but aside from that, you know, maintaining like time to be able to take care of myself in like other ways, being with family. I think family is a huge part of things. Like you can't just continue to work, and give yourself to community without understanding the obligations that you have on those around you, and then also allowing yourself to be in community with them, because that is where you will be refueled by people who love you and care about you, right? So how do you invest in maintaining those relationships with friendships and family? That's really important to do as well. And then I think faith, right? Like what am I doing to make sure that I'm continuing to build upon that, whether it's like, you know, your daily reading of Qur'an or it's being in halaqas and things like that. I actively sought those out, even though it was like scheduled blocks of like Qur'an class or like, you know, halaqah every week. Like it seems like, oh, I'm just adding more to my plate. But in all honesty, that was my way to discipline myself to make sure that I was still doing it. And those are blocks of time that I'm using for myself to do what I need to do to continue moving in the space that I'm in. If I don't carve out time to make sure that I'm doing my prayers, my words, my like everything, whatever, like how will I continue to be able to carve out 9 to 5 to be able to do the work that I'm doing?
Jazakallah khair. Yeah, I think that last part was something that I think about a lot. We all experience burnout, and you know, it's very common to hear someone say like, I want to recenter, I want to refocus. But as Muslims, like we have the ultimate, you know, like tradition when it comes to recentering and refocusing. Almost like spiritually, you know, Imam Zaid Shakir has said this in many gatherings I've been in with him, that like sometimes the spiritual will cause you to do the physically unfathomable, right? Where you see where people, it doesn't make sense, you know, to some like logically, to someone who studies things from a physical perspective, how something like fasting can increase your physical performance or physical capability, because we think of a way that's very dichotomous in that we're reducing the amount of nourishment, but we don't understand the spiritual nourishment that's coming from reducing that physical nourishment, right? When you do it for the sake of Allah. So you see people achieving much higher when they're reducing something tangible because they supplement it with spiritual nourishment. So I think that's beautiful. That, you know, that's a way to kind of bring a balance to like a hectic, you know, work 9 to 5, you know, lifestyle. Jazakallah khair. That's all the time for today. Jazakallah khair, Maheen, for coming on. We really appreciate you, you know, coming on and just telling us a little bit about your experience. You know, ultimately, the inspiration for this program is seeing, you know, just kind of zooming out on Sacramento and seeing the different pieces in our community that can bring us a holistic understanding of, you know, being righteous servants and community builders, you know, for both the generations to come and the generations living in Sacramento now, and inshallah beyond, you know, the city. So really thank you. Thank you to everyone who stuck along, you know, throughout this whole session, you know, and for those watching through our various live streams. We really appreciate your support. We appreciate your attention and your attendance. You know, this is all, you know, by the grace and will of Allah, and not by our own doing. Alhamdulillah, everything positive that's come out of this has been a result of his will and his power. Inshallah, we ask you to make dua for us and dua for Salam to keep providing these services and build on these services. We have a very exciting guest coming on for episode 3 of Hidden Gems, our third hidden gem. We're going to keep it anonymous like we did last week, so please look out for our next announcement in the next coming days. In the meantime, we encourage you all to spread the word to your families, to your friends, to tune in and hear from these hidden gems as the weeks progress. We still have 6 weeks left. So the program, is still in its early days, and there's still a chance to tune in while it's going on. So jazakallah khair. Maheen, I'm going to put you on the spot. Could you close us out with the dua, please?
Inshallah. Before I do so, I just wanted to thank you, Sam and Celine, and Salam for putting this together. I think it's a beautiful way to be able to reconnect with folks in our community, alhamdulillah. And I enjoyed the conversation, and I think I gained a lot from it as well, just to talk to both of you, alhamdulillah. So jazakumullah khairan. I'll close this out. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر وصلى الله تعالى على رسول خير خلقه محمد وآله وصحبه أجمعين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين آمين. جزاك الله خير.